So this is our At the Table with NADOI virtual roundtable series. So we've got Marina Zuna, we have Linda Kime. So the way we're going to do this discussion is we will have a series of questions that I'll present. I will let you guys know when it's your turn to respond, but some open discussion is totally fine if that goes with the flow of conversation. At the end of the panel discussion, if any of our attendees have questions, or if you'd like to pose a question in the middle, you can use your raise hand button. It's at the bottom of the, let's see, the little taskbar for Zoom off to the right. You can click that and we can see your hand raised. But otherwise, it's going to be a nice casual conversation with the topic of feral dog rehabilitation. It's something that I've got some experience with, but of course our guests here have eons more than I do. So I'm very, very much looking forward to hear what they have to say. So we will go ahead and get started. It's possible we will have another panelist join us, Monique Anstey. If she pops in, then we will catch her up and continue. All right, so our first panelist is Marina Zuna from Arizona. Marina, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, your background?
Sure. And I just really want to address what experience is relevant to the topic at hand. Two pieces of my background that come into play. One is that I lived and worked in Mexico for a decade. So a lot of what I will be referring to in the course of this discussion has to do with the dogs that I worked with during that decade period of time. I've also done a few feral rehabs here in the States. Those have a different complexion. So I want to answer some of the questions in the forum from both points of view. And just as a quick reference, been here at the ranch training dogs full-time professionally for about 40 years total, but here at the ranch for about 25. So
wow, good deal. All right, and then we have Linda Kame from Maryland. Linda, if you can give us a little background information and how you got into what you're doing.
Okay. Well, basically, as far as ferals go in particular, I actually was the recipient of probably some of the first that were brought over from the sandbox during the post 9/11 era. And the shelter that I worked at, where I was the behavior counselor, ad hoc animal, the animal care manager and behavior counselor, we received a lot of those dogs. And subsequently, the area that I lived in at the time was mostly agricultural, and a lot of times, especially in the spring and in the fall, kittens, puppies, things like that ended up showing up half grown and half starved. So we were responsible for doing something with them in order to make them tangible candidates for rehoming. And the dogs that we received from the overseas, Iraq, were not the best candidates. Most of these dogs were not only were they feral to begin with, but they had been abused as well, both by troops, both by our troops and the people that they were living amidst. So that was kind of problematic for us as well. When I lived in Pennsylvania, we had people that used to dump dogs on us all the time. And although they weren't necessarily feral, if they're after they're a certain age, you can consider them to be fairly feral. So
yeah,
there's
right.
that.
Wow. So you've got both of you have some really unique experience when it comes to that. I know most trainers, when we do have a chance to deal with feral dogs, it's like in my case, it's a rescue that ends up with them from a breeder that didn't do anything with them and they've gone into that feral state as a result. But it's going to be really interesting to hear about it from the perspectives that you guys have to share. So that's going to be great. So I am going to go ahead and jump into our first question, which is, how do you personally determine that a dog's feral rather than fearful? So obviously, we know that there's a big difference between a dog that's generally insecure and afraid and a dog that is feral. So Marina, I'm going to toss that question to you. How do you determine a dog's feral rather than fearful?
Well, let me preface that by saying I don't use that term for just behavior. For
Okay.
me, that carries with it a whole contextual series of facts. So you gave an example of a breeder pup that didn't get the right attention. To me, that's not a feral. A feral is a dog that's wild on the streets, wild in the woods, dumped in the garbage dump. So I think that I've begun to see a lot of use of that term with respect to just poorly behaving dogs. And I think that's a really misuse of the term. I'm curious what Linda thinks, because in my experience, feral has a whole set of meanings to it that come with context and really equate to no human contact, wild.
Yeah.
So to me, I think that's a really important distinction. I am seeing the use of the term in discussion groups with respect to fearful dogs, and I think that's really inappropriate. So I'm really curious to hear what Linda has to say on that.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, because even the ferals that I have met that came from that situation, it wasn't just that situation, it was the being dumped and then left to fend for themselves that created the feral state, not just the lack of socialization. So Linda, what are your thoughts on how you determine feral versus fearful?
Well, I'd be inclined to agree with Marina. There's a big difference between neglect and living on the edge. And the vast majority of dogs, and like I'm sure Marina, especially because of her proximity to Mexico, is that these people who adopt these dogs and bring them across the border, although thank God the USDA has decided to put a nix on that for a while. They come over, they don't have any handling experience. They don't have any experience with humans in close contact at all. A dog that's neglected is still often, they're thrown food occasionally. They see people. They're generally in environments where they can't escape people. So they become part of that continuity, if that makes sense. Whereas with a feral dog, they learn fairly quickly, I need to get the hell out of Dodge because bad things are going to happen if I stick around. And it's a completely different mindset. The whole dogs, I'm sure everybody here has heard it at least once or twice. The dogs were part of they were meat dogs, right? So no, most of them aren't, but they're sold that way because the Americans will buy just about anything that's got a story attached to it. But the actual meat dogs are street dogs. They're ferals. They're hunted. They're rounded up and hunted like game, and then they're caged and killed for the meat market. And the difference in those animals compared to your average purebred who got turned out on the streets accidentally is completely different. So Marina is dead on with that. There's the language when people even refer to their dogs jokingly as feral is kind of like, yeah, no, not really. It requires a different mindset to handle them. It requires a different mindset to understand them. So
yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I'm gonna go a little off plan here and throw out a side question to both of you. Would you agree that when you're seeing a feral dog versus a fearful dog, one of the biggest challenges is that feral dog has never ever had that connection with a person. You're not trying to get back to where it trusts someone. It never did trust someone. It doesn't understand being pet. It doesn't understand coming to kind words or baby talk and that sort of thing. Have you seen that kind of distinction where those things are foreign to those dogs versus one that's just fearful?
absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's a research study out there. It's old. It actually had to do with kittens, because kittens are more inclined to grow up in a wild state more frequently than domestic dogs. And they found out that if you don't imprint those kittens by the time they're about 2 or 3 weeks old, you're done. You're done. And even though, there's huge numbers of cat rescues out there that go and trap these cats and kittens and bring them in, it's like they're able to accommodate the small changes in a single household, but that wild state is always a part of them. And they're looking for ways to get out of doors. They're looking for ways to escape. So that way they can kind of revert back to that feral state fairly easily. The vast majority we owned a feral cat. She lived in my son's room for the entirety of her life. She came outside once in a blue moon, and after he joined the military, she'd come out because she wanted to make sure that someone paid attention to her food dish. But you know, I mean, if she had to survive on mousing, I would never have to feed her. She was great at just, you know, killing vermin. So she got it, you know, she accommodated the fact that she lived in close proximity to people and other dogs, but it was always from under the bed or behind the bed or under the dresser anytime someone came close. So
Gotcha. And Marina, do you agree with that? That a trait for ferals tends to be that they really lack complete understanding when it comes to things that most domestic dogs have had in their lives before, so you can get them back around to enjoying being touched and things like that more easily.
No, but I'll explain why. And this was something I wanted to bring up, is that, and that's why I set my stage in Mexico, because the underlying genetics of the dogs matters a lot. And I have lots of thoughts turning right now based on what Linda said about the cats, so I'm really curious. But what I found in Mexico was that because even in modern times, there's such a high rate of culling for dogs that are not biddable, that even dogs, much of my pack that ended up at one point in time being a 13 dog pack in Mexico came from pups that were, and typically female pups, that when they get to be 4 months of age, they're thrown away in the arroyos because they don't want to have a bitch that's whelping puppies. So they throw the female pups away, or they throw them out in the woods. And so my experience has been somewhat different and maybe unique to the setting that I'm in, although I know that Linda Hoffman has some similar experience in Bali, that the underlying genetics of biddability really affects the equation. And one of the things that we're seeing, ironically, is that because all this modern breeding and crossbreeding is paying no attention whatsoever to genetic traits of biddability, I see worse traits in some of the crossbreds that have very low biddability in their genetic scale than I did in my true Mexican ferals. My true Mexican ferals, even at 4 months of age, I had many where I would wake up and find a pup on the ranch, and they would sit in my lap for 3 days, 4 days, and be fed from my lap. And I just sort of carried them around like a papoose for 3 or 4 days, which leads us to our second question. And then about day 3, 4, 5, they were like, okay, I'm good. You can put me down now. And they just settled right in. So I don't have that experience with some of the crossbreds that I'm training nowadays. So, you know, and as Linda said, with respect to the quote unquote meat dogs, that's really not accurate. And we really need to be looking at what are some of the underlying genetics around biddability. So just I'll stop there. And just, so, you know, I come at this from different points of view. So that's a complicated question for me, because I've seen super, super high rates of biddability in the ferals that I rehabbed in Mexico versus the ferals that I've had to rehab here in the States. So curious what Linda has to say.
I'm wondering if that's a regional thing, because I'll be honest with you, the dogs that we saw being brought over from overseas, not biddable, not biddable. And even, you know, we had and I'll be honest with you, and I actually made this comment not too long ago, because although the importation of dogs from other countries has slowed dramatically because of the new USDA rules, when we were receiving dogs from, you know, the sandbox, where the first Iraq, Iran, all those places where we have military outposts, a lot of these dogs that were coming over, in particular, they were selecting bitches that were pregnant, bringing them over. Even those puppies, based upon the way that the bitches were being raised, we had to take those puppies away from their dam fairly early in order to be able to imprint them with any means of being able to, be even remotely accommodating. We would have puppies coming over about 3 or 4 months of age with their dams or with, extended family groups, let's put it that way. And these dogs were not approachable at all. I mean, it took a lot of concentrated efforts to get them to the point to where even fosters would be able to handle them normally. And I think a lot of it has to do with the genetics that Marina talks about, because over there, those dogs are selected for a very specific purpose, and they're literally allowed to stay wild because they're more effective that way. Mm-hmm. So when these dogs are coming over, they're nothing like that. They have no real human influence, and what human impact has occurred has not necessarily been kind, right? So when we get them, they're, it takes a long time, and it takes a while for them to get used to the idea that no one's going to eat you. It's okay. No one's going to eat you. You'll be fine. But I would imagine the trauma of the trip is bad enough, but the fact that they come out of an environment where essentially they're treated like scavengers and brought here is just so outside of their scope that it takes forever. And I'll be honest with you, the success rate, unless you are seriously committed to living with that dog in a way that makes sense to it, the success rate was fairly low. We had dogs that were returned routinely because they had, hair triggers. You do something the wrong way, they snap and get aggressive and stuff like that. I can see Marina's point as far as breeding goes. Yeah, we're starting to see a lot of really, really inappropriate temperaments in dogs from the quote unquote designer breeds, because not a lot of selection criterion is being made to create better temperaments. It's just a money thing. Whereas like the dogs that are, the dogs that are coming in from Mexico, dogs that are coming in off of the native preserves in Canada, dogs that were being brought over from the islands and things like that. They're all selectively different in certain ways. Genetically, there's a lot of variance. I'm sorry, Marina, what?
I agree. There's such a variance.
So I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in certain environments, dogs that have issues with humans aren't going to survive long enough to procreate. And in other environments, that's selectively chosen. I mean, they're basically doing that on purpose. So there's that. The dogs, I agree with Marina, the dogs that we had rehabilitated that were native to this country, like the dogs that we were getting from Pennsylvania, that basically people were just throwing them out into the Poconos and stuff like that. They came around a lot faster. I mean, they would always be a little timid, but you could at least housebreak them and get them to walk on a leash and get them to where they were actively being able to engage with other people and things like that. But yeah, some of these other dogs, that's just a big fat hairy no.
And all the things that both of you have said are really interesting to me, because one of the things that I've found the most fascinating with the few I've worked with, the few feral dogs I've worked with, is that consistently I've seen points in the process where they're very excited to see me, and they're displaying behaviors that for a normal dog would normally lead to soliciting touch, really interacting and that sort of thing, but something in their brain stops short of that. So you can kind of see that they don't understand like the impulse that they're naturally getting. So the talk about biddability and genetics and all of that, is fascinating when you look at it from that perspective. So I do want to go ahead and move on to our next question though, which is, if you have one, how would you describe your general philosophy or your overall approach when it comes to rehabilitating dogs? And we'll bounce this over to Marina first.
Pretty much typical to how I approach all training is I don't have a philosophy. I really try and stay in the particularities of the situation. I would say that I do a lot of training, what I call training from the inside out. So when I first came to Arizona, I used to see a ton of lab pity crosses. Don't ask me why, but that was like the thing that we saw dozens and dozens of lab pity crosses. And so for purposes of a stable pet dog, you would train to the lab piece using prey drive and movement and extinguish the reactivity of the pity. And at that time, that worked terrific. You could just stabilize the dog and bring out the pieces that you wanted and extinguish the pieces that you don't want. With a feral, you know, you may, and particularly again, depending on the region that they're coming from and exactly what Linda said, whether they're coming from south of the border, north of the border, coming from a culture where dogs are not part of the family home, which is a huge difference. Coming in from Asia, again, a huge difference in the genetics, what Linda said, what they're being selected for. I'm trying to look for what is the piece of the genetic puzzle that I can train to. I don't train to the whole puzzle. So I'm trying to strengthen a particular piece and extinguish pieces that aren't useful for that dog's existence as a pet dog. So what that looks like is going to be very particular to the dog. And I think that where I make mistakes is, and where I see people make mistakes is, oh, this is a feral dog protocol. Nah, not so much. You know, do we have terrier in there? Do we have hound? Do we have cur? What do we have in there? What do we have in that mix that I can use? Where's my handle? What can I seize upon that is the most trainable piece that's going to get me the most bang for my buck? So for me, it's a very individual assessment.
That makes sense. And Linda, do you have a particular philosophy or approach that you typically use with feral dogs?
I treat them all like puppies. I treat them all like baby puppies. I treat them like the tabula rasa, like they know nothing, and we go from there. And the vast majority of these dogs, they won't accept food from your hand. They won't accept, you know, they won't drink or eat in your presence. They basically have a tendency to be super defensive. So I treat them like baby puppies. I am the wellspring through which all good things flow. If you want to eat, you have to eat with me present. Otherwise, you don't get to eat. And the cool thing about ferals is they recognize that fairly quickly. So they're like, I get hungry fast, and my primordial instinct is I need to consume food when it's available. So we use that to help overcome a lot of those stasis points where they're not willing to move forward. And we try and go as slow as we try to go as fast as possible, but we go as slow as we need to. But yeah, I'm not going to lie, a lot of deprivation occurs there. And it's not anything that we impose upon the animal. It's something that the animal imposes upon itself. A lot of these guys, I don't know what Marina's setup is like, but these dogs are actually housed in my home. And so we'll actually tether in the crate so that way we can extract them safely. And that way we can actually, you know, put them in the crate safely as well without getting bitten and things like that. And we have some heavy duty indestructible crates with which we use for dogs like that. And basically what they learn in a fairly short order is, I'm not dying, nothing bad's happening to me. So they start kind of letting go of some of that really over the top inappropriate behavior. And it's like I said, anything they want, anything that they value, including freedom, food, water, all of these things, the comforts that they seek are through a human handler. And that's the only way that I mean, it's worked for me. Unless something better comes along, I think I'll stick with that because it's been fairly successful so far.
Good deal. And I like both of what you said. Like one thing I hadn't thought about is really looking at what the dog is that Marina was talking about, looking at the breeds that make up the dog and where you can pull information from that to know what you can work with. And then on the subject of deprivation, I don't, personally, I don't know that we have much of a choice when you have a dog who doesn't see you in any way, shape, or form as a positive thing, or anything that comes from you as a positive thing. You don't have the ability to just use food normally or use any of the other methods formally as we normally would. So that makes perfect sense to me. Now, I am going to skip over a couple of these questions because we kind of went over them earlier, but I want to jump to you know, when you would consider a feral dog to be too much of a liability or too much of a risk to even attempt rehabilitation. So we'll go to Marina again for that question.
I'm going to bump to Linda to start, and I want to think about that in terms of the different populations. So let me let Linda start that one, and I'll come back at it.
I'll be honest with you, I don't really have a hard, honest answer for that. The last dog we had that he was a feral dog. He was a mature adult Jack Russell Terrier. God knows how long this dog had lived on the streets. And he was great until he wasn't, and then he was very bad. And as a mature adult, I mean, the agency that contacted me and asked me if I would accept this dog basically had him aged at about 5 or 6, I think. But on his veterinary intake, he had 6 adult teeth removed. And I'm like, this is not the age of a dog that has that many teeth removed. And I actually saw x-rays of the dentition, and thank God I worked in vet med for a long time, because I'm looking at that and I'm going, that's an old dog. That's a dog who's at least double digits. And so, you know, for the prognosis for an animal that old without having any background and knowing that he lived wild for a fairly long period of time, the indication wasn't really good for him to begin with. But we kept at it for 14 months before I made the command decision to put him down. The dog prior to him was actually an English Shepherd who had been part of a pack of 9 that were essentially left to live in a barn by themselves. I think their dam was with them until she got knocked up by one of her sons at a very early age. And they ended up hooking her out of there. But the guy that had them was hoping beyond hope that he would still be able to sell them, because purebred English Shepherd. And yeah, there was 9 of them. And the one that I got, of course, was probably the worst one. I mean, this dog had liquid poo anytime a human approached him. And he stayed on. This is a dog who, I actually wrote about it on Facebook at one point. He would throw himself against a cinder block wall to escape whatever human was in the room. And at the time, that room happened to be 121 feet by 85 feet. I am not even lying about this. We had these big overhead doors, and he would fling himself in desperation to try and escape. We finally got him to the point to where we had him completely trained. I actually went to an e-collar to help him understand that he was the harbinger of his own discomfort. And that took over 10 months. And he was a young dog. He was, God, I want to say like 6 or 7 months old when we got him. So we had him until, and he lives right down the road from me. He's a nice dog now, but that's a 1 in a million. And I mean, again, he had some human influence. People at least threw them whole bags of food, at least every couple of days. So, but yeah, it depends on the dog.
And some decent genetics behind him as well. So that probably contributed to being able to reach him finally at some level.
To him, yeah. I mean, English Shepherds are not difficult dogs, no matter how crappily bred they are. But yeah, the Jack Russell was just a no-go. So
I think about this in terms of a quote that a vet on the border once said to me when we were evaluating one of my own dogs. And I was really shocked because nice Catholic boy. I didn't even know if he believed in euthanasia, and it was the topic of discussion because of a medical situation that we were wrestling with. And he said to me, you know, he said, there has to be a quality of life for both parties. This is supposed to be a relationship, and there has to be a quality of life for both parties. And I think about that often, pretty much daily anymore, when I read the countless posts about living with a dysfunctional animal, and not even a feral. So I'll come back to the feral because, again, my situation is unique in that my ferals were very, very biddable once they settled into the ranch, and probably a higher rate of biddability than nearly 90% of the pet dogs I've ever trained. Again, the product of select genetics, and genetics specifically selected for no other trait than high biddability, not selected for color, not selected for coat quality, not selected for drive, just selected for biddability. So that's a very unique subset. But in terms of the general question, I think it has to be evaluated at both ends. I mean, is the human living in constant lockdown? Is the dog living in constant lockdown? Is
Interesting you should
has,
say that.
yeah, has the owner's circle of life become restricted in a way that if that were a human doing that to the person, all of our red flags would go off and we would say, you're in an abusive relationship. One of the first things we look at in terms of evaluating abuse is, has the circle tightened? How much has the person been cut off from normal intercourse with the world? And when it gets to the point, I mean, it's a choice. It's a personal choice for every individual. But in my mind, hearing my wonderful vet's voice in my ears, when it gets to the point where the person's quality of life is substantially compromised, that's not why we have dogs in our lives, to me. If that's the commitment that you want to live in, and you're conscious of the choice, and you're aware of what ways it's limiting you and what ways it has changed your life, well, that's a choice. Not a choice I personally want to make or recommend for my clients. So I think it really comes down to a two-way street on quality of life.
It's interesting that you say that, because there's, I mean, and the thing is, it's like for so many years now, pet people have been indoctrinated into this belief that a dog is for life, right? The veterinarian community has been indoctrinated into believing that that is in fact so. There's very few vets who will put down a healthy dog. Behavior euthanasia is a serious topic of conversation, and it's an uncomfortable topic for people to have. We as a species have a tendency to basically just, divorce ourselves from spouses and from children and from significant others and friends, employers, employees, on down the list. But when it comes to our animals, for some weird reason, we have this aberrated commitment to stay with that animal for the rest of its life, even when it's unhealthy. And the whole rescue community, and it's like, and this the thing with feral dogs, the thing with dogs period, is this whole, I'm going to say it out loud, the adopt don't shop nonsense, right? So we have this condition where we're told that we're horrible people for making choices for ourselves, right? So we have to make these decisions predicated on what other people think we should do, which, oh, I adopted a feral from Bali. And I mean, like you hear the stories. I know Marina hears the stories. I hear them, and it makes me just, seethe, but whatever. The problem is getting people to understand that it's okay to let go. That, and especially in this community, there's a particular rescue or shelter or whatever they're calling themselves today, wildly popular, financial fundraising megalith. I mean, these people are good, but they do nothing to benefit animals. And they're one of the people that continue to import dogs from other countries. When in Baltimore City, you can't walk down the street with seeing a loose pit bull. I have a client of mine who does rescue, basically some kind of impromptu rescue. He just picked up a puppy that's probably about 6 or 7 months old. The dog weighs like 17 pounds. He should weigh probably about 30 or 40, right? Stuff like that. But back to the point being, people seem to think that it's okay to feel guilty and to stay in that stasis. I think that's called mental illness. And I think that it's important for people to realize that it's okay. You just kicked your husband out. It's okay to say no to this dog. But then you have the rescues in the shelters, like these people down the street, who are essentially saying, well, if you bring the dog back here, we're going to kill it. Let me be the first one to say, by all means, feel free, right? And people are afraid of that. They don't want to hear that. And when it comes, especially when it comes to dogs that they think are disadvantaged because they're from third world countries or they have behavioral deficits or whatever, they're more than willing to invest that kind of emotional investment into that animal when it's destined to be hopeless anyways, if that makes sense. So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at on it. I think that it's like Marina said, it's a personal choice, but I think that maybe we should try to help people understand that it's not the only choice they have. Because I mean, I see a lot. Marina, out of curiosity, how many people have you counseled for euthanasia in the last 5 years?
Well, some of that's tricky because obviously COVID stopped things, and then I'm sort of transitioning to teaching more rather than taking in dogs. But prior to that, I would say it was, at least a couple times a month I would have the conversation.
Okay,
And
next question. How many of it was because the dog was so bad or because the people were incapable and you knew that dog had no help anywhere else?
they were all really dedicated people who felt shamed and guilty because they couldn't create solutions for a dog that there were no solutions for.
Okay.
And I was the first person, I can't tell you how many phone conversations I've had with the person sobbing, male, female, young, old, across the board, on the other end of the phone, because I was the first person that didn't shame them about saying, you don't have to feel guilty about this. This isn't your fault. You didn't create this. There might have been things we could have done differently, but you didn't create this and you don't have to live with this.
That's interesting, because the vast majority of my counseling for euthanasia is because the people are not capable of handling the dog they have. And the dog is unsafe enough that it would be, I don't know about Arizona, but in Maryland, we have a thing called, oh God, not attractive nuisance. It's another thing, but basically it's like, if we're part of the provenance for that dog, we own some of the liability for that dog's behavior. So if I have a client and that client's dog is a biter, and I know that that dog is a biter, if they don't disclose that information at the next home that dog goes to, I can be held liable, right? To a certain degree. And basically, as a result, it forces us to exercise a considerable amount of caution when we talk to people who have dangerous dogs, regardless of the source. The vast majority of dogs that I'm seeing are post-COVID dogs who have had absolutely no socialization, and they have become dangerous dogs. In capable hands, in those unicorn homes, that dog would be fine. In other homes, absolutely not. And the people I have two of them sitting in my house right now, right? One is a lovely Dutch Shepherd. He's 16 weeks or 16 months old. He's an adolescent male Dutch Shepherd, right? Perfectly homeable dog. But in the home he was in, because of his owner's lack of follow through and unrealistic expectations, that dog has become a dangerous dog, right? So he's here now because he's not a dangerous dog. He's just an adolescent idiot. But if I were to place that dog in any other situation, if that dog bites, guess who's on the hook for him? Me, right? So when we counsel people for euthanasia, we counsel them for euthanasia not because the dog is horribly bad, but because they cannot assume responsibility for that dog's behavior after the dog leaves them. Going back to feral dogs, they're stuck in an environment where they can't give that dog up to another home. What are they going to do with it? And they become like Marina states, and they're essentially living in an environment where they can't leave the house. The dog is too destructive. They can't have people over. There's no quality of life, and they're guilted into thinking that these dogs need to live forever because that's the culture we live in. I don't necessarily think that that's appropriate.
And I agree, and you both made excellent points as far as that goes. And I think a lot of people don't take the time. It's very easy for us to say, well, I can keep putting up with it. I can keep putting up with it. And I think they have the guilt that causes that, and they have the media. We see all these stories. But one thing that they don't understand and they don't look at is the process that the dog itself has to go through, because when we're talking about a feral dog and you have a dog who you enter the room and it urinates, defecates everywhere,
I'll be back in a moment.
and you have no way to comfort it in that moment. Well, we have to look at how long is this going to take before every waking moment for this dog is not a nightmare for it, because it just is not, it's not created for the environment that we're putting it in. So sometimes I wonder if maybe if it was presented more along those lines, like, guess what, you're not actually being very kind to the animal sometimes when you decide to keep it alive. It's very, very good points, and a really complex conversation around behavioral euthanasia itself, which may have to make that a topic sometime because it's a big one. Real quick, we have a Monique. Is that Monique Anstey or is that Monique Williams?
I'm Monique Anstey and I'm here.
Oh,
Finally.
welcome.
Thanks.
Good deal. So I am not going to throw the next question to you. I'm going to let you get a chance to settle in. But just to remind everyone, Monique Anstey is one of our panelists. So I will be addressing further questions to you, Monique, and we'll take turns, or the panelists will take turns responding to those. Let's see. So the next one I want to cover, what is, and we'll do Marina first. What is your first priority? You first get a feral dog. What is the very first thing you're thinking about? What's the first thing that you know that you need to do or assess or set up for that dog?
Could we possibly go back to the last question? Because I'm really curious of Monique's input on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Monique, what we were talking about was the question of when would you consider a feral dog too much of a risk to rehabilitate in terms of safety or the dog's quality of life, resources, etc. And I just want to, before I dump it to Monique, I just want to add on to what Linda said. For me, there's a big difference between, and I suppose at the end of the circle they meet, but when I'm evaluating a dog like that, there's a big difference for me in terms of a dog who's a risk of harm to others and a dog whose risk of harm is more internal. For me, there's sort of two different assessments. They might end up at the same place, but I bring, as Linda said, there are different legal considerations involved. If the dog is not eating and just running from room to room, that's not going to get me sued. But a dog that's going to go bite anybody that casually comes near the house, that's a whole other equation. So unfortunately, the legalities of that, like Linda was talking about, create a different set of considerations. So, but just to take it back to the feral dog, I think we have, a complexity of the puzzle depending on, one of the problems with true ferals is that they can ping pong from self-destructive to externally destructive in an instant. So anyway, I'm going to flick it to Monique and see what her thoughts are on that.
In some ways, I think I'm lucky that I'm kind of isolated up here in Canada doing my own thing. Because some of what you're saying, I haven't come across that. So for me, so the question is too dangerous to rehab, right? So we're not talking the end product. We're talking that I won't even start delving into that. So my first thing that I'm always looking at with a dog like that is, does it have a family? If it does, then I'm willing to go along, so long as there isn't a bite involved in the dog with children in the home. If there is, it's a no-go for me. If ever kids are at risk, I won't. It's just too dangerous. I might help them, but it's going to be incredibly clear about the risk to the kids if there is a risk there. So that's the first one. It's completely different in my head if a dog does not have a family versus does have a family. If it's going to need training, And I know there's absolutely no way I'm going to place that dog. That's so different. So I am looking for, is there a bite there? And also, as odd as this sounds, endearing qualities. Like Leppy that I had, I didn't like him that much as a dog. So to me, he wasn't one that I would have, me personally, I would have put in a home, but he wasn't my dog, so it wasn't my choice. Whereas Fox was worse behaved by far, but he was so endearing and lovely that he kind of was worth it in the long run. So back to the quality of life and that, I'm assuming that through my training, I've got them through that. If they're still panicking and not enjoying their days, then I haven't rehabbed, and at which point I would definitely euthanize,
I
because
agree.
it's all about quality of life for the dog. But as a trainer, it's my job to get them through that. So I'm hoping I do. There, have I answered? I kind of missed some, I missed the beginning too, because there's also different levels of ferals, right? Like there's all the Mexican street dogs that we're seeing that they're a handful, but they're really endearing and nice little dogs.
That's what Maria.
Then there's a whole different level of feral that is just a wild dog coming into your house. And those are the ones I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
Definitely. And Monique, I love your point about a very real point, very raw point about needing that dog to be a little endearing. And I think it's important to think about how much time and effort is put into these dogs. They really do need a little bit of redeeming quality when you're having to put so much effort and so much time, you know, and you've got this dog that, unlike most dogs, at least at the beginning, is not giving you reciprocal appreciation or affection. It's all you. So it does help when there's an enduring quality there to look at, or it's a breed that you really love, or something there that you can latch onto.
Yeah.
So I want to move forward a little bit. And I'm going to pose this question a little bit differently than I had it written. So this question was about the first signs of progress that you usually see, but I want to pose another question with that. So what are the first signs of progress that are usually seen in these cases? And I want to talk a little bit about the timeline. And obviously it's going to be different for every dog, but I'd like to give our attendees an idea of just how long it can take to actually see real progress with a dog like this. So we'll circle back around to Marina and make our way around again.
Thank you so much. And Monique, just to bring you up to flying speed, one of the things I introduced myself as, my experience with ferals had to do with living in Mexico for a decade. And so I have a very particular genetic pool of dogs that my experience was with. And you're absolutely right. Very, very different than Linda was talking about the dogs that she first saw, which were coming in from the sandbox in the Middle East. And those are wild, 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 and very different than what I was seeing. So with respect to Terry's question, in my population, oh boy, let me address this in two ways. Because I do body work, I do craniosacral work, I'm always looking at internal pieces of organization. So, and because I did horses, I'm looking at things like pulse rate and respiration and craniosacral pulse rhythm. So I'm looking at core pieces, like is the animal, just in lay terms, calmer than it was the day before? So if I'm near it, does the pulse rate stay the same? Does the respiration stay the same? Or do we immediately go into adrenaline flood and, we have fluttering heartbeat and gasping respirations or some other level of extreme? So I'm monitoring that stuff all the time, whether I have a stethoscope on or not, which I don't usually. I can just put my hand on the dog's side and see where we're at with those kind of parameters. So again, I'm kind of always wanting to see changes from the inside out. Obviously I look at things like, eye engagement and focus and food drive and those things, but those things are later on. In the beginning, I just want the dog to take a breath. Like, just breathe here, girlfriend, just breathe. And I think that people rush the stages. They want the dog to love them. They want the dog to be near them. They want the dog to let them touch them. I just let the dog breathe. Just like, let them breathe in my proximity. Let's just start there. So let me just stop there and toss it to my colleagues.
Easiest question so far to date. Progress to me is a dog who actually starts actively seeking feedback or attention. And as far as how long it takes what it takes. I mean, you know, the younger the dog, the less of a row you have to hoe. The older the dog, the more work you have cut out for you. That's, you know, and that's really no different than any other training of any other dog, as far as I'm concerned. It's just a little bit, you know, I mean, you have a tendency to approach ferals a little slower than you would another, you know, a normal quote unquote dog. And basically you just have to sit there and wait for the dog to give you signals that show that it's moving in the direction you want it to go. That's it.
Yeah. And then Monique, same question. What are the first signs of progress that you usually see? And can you give us kind of an idea of how long you typically would expect the process to take of making significant progress?
So my first priorities are giving them mental peace and removing their panic. It's about their quality of life. And I want to be seeing their panic starting to go away within 2 or 3 days. Not going away, because that's obviously going to take longer, but I should see about a 50% reduction in that panic within the first few days. If I'm not, it's going to take years to go. Now, as I say that, with the exception of one dog, which was recent and wasn't a feral, I'm normally able to do that. So my signs of progress are, I want to see less bolting, less panic, and I want to see the dog having more moments of joy each day, just kind of leaving the demons in their head behind for certain set moments, and then that increasing and increasing. So, yeah.
Makes sense. And then one of which I have limited experience, of course, but when I've consulted others who have dogs like this, one of the things I try to get across to them is that, you know, you can't get progress from an animal that's not rested, from an animal that doesn't have a home base, a safe zone. So a lot of what you have all said really does point to getting that animal to a place where it can decompress before we can make that forward progress. Let's see. So this next question that I have, it may or may not apply. I threw this in there because this is something I've seen and I'm curious about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the three of you have seen. So I know that for me, it is not uncommon to hit portions of the rehabilitation process where we're making progress, we're doing new things, and then we kind of plateau. When we're starting to introduce new routines and get this dog used to new things, they get to a point where life is much more enjoyable for them and they kind of want to hang there. They push back a little bit more when we want to increase that challenge. So my question is that something that any of you have run into? And what are some ways that you have worked a dog past that point of it falling into maybe a comfort zone where it was pushing back a little bit more? And we'll start with Marina.
I think that's a general training question that I see a lot of younger trainers hitting pretty much daily on all of the groups. So I'm not sure that applies just to ferals. I'll answer it in two ways. One, I think that people create a set of expectations and want to jump from expectation to expectation without evaluating the dog in front of them. And the fine art of, one of the things I love about both Linda and Monique's training is their ability to break things down into teeny tiny steps. And my competition trainer is brilliant at that, okay, this isn't working. How do I break that apart into 10 steps? not my strong point, but I learned over the years. And typically for me, whether it's a feral or not, if I hit that plateau, it's because I've jumped too many steps for the dog's foundation or their ability to absorb the information. With a feral particularly, it's 99% that I've made some assumption about some piece of core foundation that I should not have made an assumption about, that I have to just step back from the picture and go, okay, what is it about this piece that the dog's not getting? I don't find it to be at all a piece of emotional, like the dog's at an emotional comfort level and doesn't want to proceed. I find it always to be a matter, in my opinion, a matter of there's a piece missing to move to whatever next level it is that I'm trying to move the dog to. And there's something I'm assuming that is not valid. So that would be my take on that.
That makes sense. And so essentially you're saying that when you're looking at that next step that you want to take, it's all about breaking that down into smaller steps and analyzing what that dog is going to need to be able to do to get to that step rather than just making a leap and hoping it sticks.
Yes, for the most part, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. And then Linda, same question.
So the first question is who's handling this dog? A professional trainer or so because it's multifaceted, and Marina points out that basically you talk about, you know, breaking things down into their component parts and make it much easier for the dog to understand. And that's easy to say if you're a trainer and actually know what you're doing. That's much harder for your average layperson who has absolutely no experience with which to be able to bring to the equation. So part of that for me, just with the general dog population that we work with on a daily basis, we achieve a level of expectation, or owners achieve a level of expectation, and that becomes good enough, right? So then when all of a sudden there's an episode that indicates that maybe more training is needed, the dog's like, wait a minute, this has been good enough. Why do I have to try any harder? Right. And one of the things that I constantly tell my clients are basically, and I was actually writing these notes, that any effort that the dog makes in a positive or forward direction requires a higher level of expectation for the next repetition automatically. And if you don't, because it's just like with kids, you know, I mean, I struggled with math. I suck at math. I produced a math genius. How that happened, I don't know, but I suck at math. And even now, it's without a calculator, because that's the way I was trained. I can do math, but there's just no spontaneity, right? Because I have to continue to do that one thing that nobody wants to do, which is called what, ladies? Practice. Okay. So part of the problem is there's two facets. There's the extinction burst, where you have this flurry of up and down behaviors, and all of a sudden the dog just kind of levels out and everything is fine. Well, then we no longer put pressure on the dog to perform because he has already exhausted all of those prior behaviors, and now he has achieved this level of not relaxation, because that's not the case. This level of the Peter Pan principle. He achieves a certain level, and that's basically, as far as he's concerned, the dog, that's as far as he has to go. And as long as he causes no problems for anybody, that's good for his owners as well. Well, people who actually work with dogs know that that never lasts, right? So we have to continue to help the dog achieve greater levels of understanding in order to push all those memories of trauma and all those memories of escape and avoidance far enough back to where the dog has learned better coping skills, right? Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Makes sense. And Linda, I think your explanation actually helped me realize I could have posed this question a little bit more clearly in terms of talking about, you know, when we hit the point where we found out maybe what we're doing is putting too much pressure on the dog. So I'm sure all three of you have probably gotten to a point working with a feral dog, because who knows, especially at the beginning, exactly what's going to happen when you start adding a little bit of pressure on them and how they're going to be able to handle it. So as I toss the question over to Monique, I want to kind of give those details too, as far as when we're talking about pushing the dog past the comfort zone. You know, when do you and how do you determine maybe it's time to back up, time to reassess?
I was late to join this, so I think I actually need to start at the beginning with my philosophy and approach with feral dogs. So how I'm actually starting them. And when I'm first getting one, everything I'm doing is via freedom and allowing them to move their feet. So I'm not putting any pressure or control on them. It's their choice. And I am that crazy person that cuts these runaway dogs loose, and I go on a bike and then they learn to chase me. Initially, they want to bolt, see I'm faster, and then they're quite happy to just tag along behind me. So the very first thing I'm teaching them is that I will let them move, but they need to do it by following me. So, and until you teach a dog to follow you, I don't think we can really train them. So that's my starting point. From there, I'm then using certain environments to get them used to being in tight spaces, because we all know they don't do well in tight spaces. So I'm not using the typical ones that would be their issue. I'm using things like the front seat of my car, and I'm putting another dog on that seat with them. So they know the front seat now takes them to fun places where they get to move. So they have more tolerance because they know they're going somewhere good. So that's the easiest way to start teaching them that. Once they have that, I'm then going to be taking them into like a tight trail in the forest with underbrush on either side. And that will freak them out just as much. So the tightness of spaces is the next piece I'm working on. And then I'm using dogs to show them how they should behave in scenarios. So I'm really not putting any pressure on them to start with. However, as I say that, change is pressure. Living in a house is pressure. Like they have so much pressure coming at them anyways that it's still happening. But I'm not requiring things of them in a formal way, I guess is what I want to say. So then I agree that a plateau is normal with all dogs. And I think whenever we're training a dog, we always make huge gains fast. Like within the first week or the second week, you should be seeing a minimum of 50% improvement, probably closer to like 80%. And then we all know that last tiny bit takes so much longer to get. And I think that's probably the plateau that you're talking of. It's kind of, we get them to a certain point and then it's like, now I barely see any progress. The difference with the ferals, I think, and why it's so obvious with the ferals, that plateau, is because they have so far to come. So even though they may have improved 50 to 80%, it's not even close to good enough, right? They're still a wild dog. So that's the obvious thing with our feral. So how am I getting them through that? I just keep pushing, like little pushes. So I've asked them now to deal with tight spaces, to learn things from my other dogs. The tight spaces are now going to come in different scenarios. I'm being stupid around the house. Like, I remember with Leppy, I hid in the closet and jumped out and yelled boo at him. And I got to the point with Leppy that I would do that and he'd run one step, turn, and then charge. Like, he kind of thought that the stupid stuff was really funny. So I'm putting them kind of into moments where they would panic and making it a game. And Coco just left here, and I don't think I was able to get her to even panic at the end. Like, she's so used to me doing stupid stuff. Like, if I'm sweeping, I'll turn on them and run at their feet. So it's always just another game coming. They just learn that I'm really stupid and something's always going to happen, and they learn to kind of find their humor and come back at me with it. So there's always pushes coming at them. I'm going to take them to different places, different experiences. And I think even just living in my house with my own dogs, because I have a male shepherd, intact shepherd, and I have my male Malinois. So those two are both very powerful, strong dogs. I think even just living among those two dogs is such a good push for so many of these little weirdos. It really helps them to just get stronger, more confident. Coco was an extreme panicker. And the first time she even saw Johnny, he just kind of trotted around and she saw him and screamed and bolted. And at the end, he's shoving his toy in her face and she's not moving. So I think even just living in scenarios like that with other strong dogs. So just through life, just keep pushing them, but in fun ways, not as training challenges. And I think to that, I do very little formal training with my ferals, very little. It's all just living with them, showing them the world and games.
That makes perfect sense. And a lot of that resonates with the experience that I have with the current feral that I'm working with, as far as being silly. And we do a play ball game every morning and dances, and so that's kind of the plateau I see with her, is that she's very happy with our current routine. And so I have to find more creative ways to push her a little bit. But that was very, what's that?
I would say pick her up and spin her through the air and toss her on your bed. Like my games are always just increasing.
I mean, I got a 50-50 shot. She's either going to love it or she's gonna poop on me. Like there is no in between. But I love the point that you made as far as pressure goes. And I think all of you have, one way or another, addressed the fact that when you're working with a feral dog, the relief of pressure, and of course we use this in other training too, but the relief of pressure is often all we have. So if you are not somebody who can analyze for this particular dog what is putting pressure on it, if you can't read that dog inside out to figure that out, then you're not going to be successful, or at least not quickly. And that's what I've found when I see these dogs. In my case, I see these dogs coming from various rescues and shelters and that sort of thing. And I've had people say, oh, the dog is very, very sweet. And this is the ones that just shut down, and thankfully they don't bite. I get one or the other. And oh, it's very, very sweet, just very scared. And then I find out that this dog is not, we don't know that this dog is sweet. We don't know this dog. We have not met this dog yet. And that can be very difficult to get across to people. We have no idea who this dog is yet. We're just very lucky no one's been bitten so far, because we think, because of the internet, that we sit down and we stroke it and we baby talk and it'll magically love us again. That's not how that works. But anyway, pressure is what it's all coming down to. And when our life as humans, our human life with our animals is the pressure, then all you have as a reward is finding ways to relieve that pressure. So I love your description, Monique, even though it does admittedly terrify me to think I just let it run loose. But I've followed your stories, and clearly you've got it down, and it works very well. Let's move on a little bit, because we have to get to our attendee questions, if any of them have them, pretty soon. I want to go ahead really quick. For those of you who have gotten to a point where you rehabbed a feral dog that needed a new home, or maybe you haven't, but you know what that would look like for you, what would you want to see before you were comfortable sending that dog to a not random person, but a normal person's home? Obviously, we're going to prepare them for what they need to do, but what do you want to see from that dog to decide that that dog is ready for a home life? We'll start with Marina again.
Well, I'm just thinking that I think Monique and my other colleagues who train in a similar way have had a vast impact on me, because I really want to see a certain level of resilience to play. I want to see a certain level of resilience to touch. And resilience for me is really a key component of assessment. So I want to be able to, I want to be able to push that dog over. I want that dog to be able to come between my legs and rock between my legs. I want to be able to push that dog on its chest, push it on its hindquarters. I test all these things. I'm assessing all these things daily, hourly, throughout the course of the day. And like Monique, I do a lot of games with it. I was not a games person, and we all have had a bad influence on me. Now I have to figure out all the games to play. No, it's really important. And so one of the things that people take for granted is approach. An approach is a really big deal with a feral. I want my dogs to be able to be approached, whether from the side, from the front, from the back, from the top, over. That's a big assessment for me. Can they do those basic things? When people are moving through a house, they're not going to be paying attention to, oh, I have to move this way past Fluffy. They're just going to walk to the bathroom or walk to the kitchen. Fluffy's got to cope with those things. So I don't take those things for granted. I teach approach. I teach resilience to touch, to spatial pressure, just like Monique is talking about. So I have a checklist of basic things I want the dog to be able to tolerate, that the dog needs to be able to handle plain old stuff. So that's, there's sort of a long list, but that, basic handleability, basic spatial tolerance, basic, and I do, like Monique, I do a lot of stuff with noise and sound as well. So they've got to be able to come up to some level of resilience for me that, and I kind of know from having done thousands of dogs where I want to see that at. That's not terribly useful. And this makes me think about putting that into words and putting that into an article. What exactly is it that I'm assessing when I'm making those assessments? So toss to Linda.
Linda, do you have do you have an idea of what is it you want to see from a feral dog before you decide that it's ready to go to normal home life?
I want it to act less feral.
Yeah.
I think that, I'll be honest with you. I don't think that there's a lot of difference between what Monique does or what Marina does or what I do or anyone else does when it comes to actually physically taking an animal out of one situation and preparing it for another. That's going to look different based on the individual dog, but that's not going to be different overall. So I want the dog to be willing to make approaches towards strangers. I want the dog to be able to accommodate the presence of other dogs. I want the dog to be handleable by someone other than the people that have been responsible for its rehabilitation. And I want it to be able to function in any environment it finds itself in. That's fairly straightforward. I don't think that that's any different than an expectation that I would have for any other dog that I train. And the caveat being is because this dog comes from a circumstance that is very dissimilar to most of the dogs that I work with, I want the people that are going to be assuming responsibility for this dog to know unequivocally how to handle this dog. So they have to go through a training program with the dog. Someone made I think it was Monique made the comment earlier about, the dog has to have a family. Most of the times when I get these dogs, they come to me from a rescue or a foster situation. If the dog is going to be returning to the foster situation, the foster has to go through the experience with the dog. If the dog is part of a rescue situation, I keep the dog until a home is found for it. And that's one of the reasons why I keep these dogs for a protracted period of time, because again, like I said before, I'm liable. I can be part of that liability loop if anything happens. So I want to be the one that makes sure that that dog is ready to go. And I'm going to be part of the selection team for the person that dog is going to. But everything else being equal, essentially the dog should be as close to, perfect as you can get it under those circumstances. So I don't think that should be much different for anybody's ideals.
Gotcha. And Monique, what would you want to see if you were placing a feral dog into, or hopefully a no longer feral dog into a home? What characteristics would you want to see as far as progress?
There's degree of ferals, right? There's the typical Mexican kind of street dog that we see in everyone's homes. That dog's completely different than a Leppy or a Fox, which were the recent ones I had. So on the typical type of street dog, I want to see a home where they're not going to be bombarding them with rules and expecting them to do their unleashed neighborhood walk every day, because that's going to set the dog right back and they're going to hate their lives. However, in the case of the second generation ferals, which is so much worse, like the foxes, the leppies. I think we have to be really honest with ourselves that the only type of person that's going to take that dog is not going to be the ideal home. Any ideal home wouldn't even consider them. So when it comes to that, I think we have to have real compassion for the people as time progresses and they undo all of our work or create some new immense problem in the dog. It's inevitable. Because I think the people with the skills to maintain that kind of dog just wouldn't willingly go into it. So I didn't answer your question anyway there. But so what am I actually looking for in the dog? No panic, no matter what I do to them. I think that's my biggest one. I need that panic gone. So they're not doing pee trails around my house. They're stable. I can flick them with a dishcloth in my kitchen if I'm making food on the butt and they think it's funny. I want to get them to that point that no matter what, I really can't make them panic. Now, as I say that, these dogs will still panic, but I can't elicit it anymore. So, is that true though? They will still panic. I hadn't when Fox left and when Leppy left, both of them. Leppy did panic a tiny bit. Fox was not. So I think that may depend on the dog. I need them to come when called. That's key. They need to listen, because if these dogs need this freedom, and I believe they do, then it has to be at a point that their new home will be able to manage them safely out and about in the world. And just a factor for me, I think to put this dog on any family or people, they need to have affection and seek their people out. Otherwise, what's the point? So that's a big one for me. If they're not seeking me out and wanting my attention and being a normal dog in that way, they're not worthy of going into a home. That sounds so terrible to say that, but it's true. So I'm okay with them being a high maintenance pet, but they still have to be a pet at that point. They can no longer be a wild dog. So they need to be easy to manage and handle for the people to take them to the vet. And I don't want to see any reactivity in there. And now any is a very strong word but I should be able to walk them on leash easily without them misbehaving towards other people or dogs. Or if they're off leash, I can call them back, put them on a leash with no response to people or dogs. So that's what I'm looking for.
Makes sense.
I think, yeah.
You made a comment about second generation, which I want a clarification on. And the other thing was you had made mention of, as far as like the instability of a dog's temperament. And one of the questions that we had earlier was, what decisions would you make to determine whether or not that dog was viable enough to place in another home, or whether or not you would consider behavioral euthanasia? And you had made the comment about whether the dog was able to, kind of internalize his feral state and become a little bit more happy and more stable. So would that dog that wasn't able to do that qualify for behavior euthanasia for you, or what? But then first what is a second generation? I'm not real clear on that.
I wasn't either, and I might be wrong in even saying that, but it was explained to me with Leppy that there's first generation and second generation ferals. And a friend of mine works a lot with cats. So cats, we get to see the different generations of ferals here. So a first generation feral kitten is easy to rehab. A second generation is not.
Is not.
You can't tame them, even as a kitten.
Yeah, I wish you'd have been here for that. Okay, because that clarifies it for me. And like one of the conversations that we had early on was the dogs that are coming over from the Middle East. These are not even second generation. These are multiple generational dogs that are born literally in the wild, because they can keep them at bay, but they still serve a purpose as being alarm dogs and guardian dogs for livestock and things like that. So thank you for clarifying that for me.
I so wish I was here for that earlier conversation, because I even had notes written about those dogs. I think the further south the dogs are coming from, the worse their temperament. Yeah. And the more edgy they are and the harder they are to manage.
Yeah.
Such as, I love my Mexicans. I hate taking dogs from Iran. I'm yet to meet one that I've loved. They are such a handful.
I I got a lot of experience with them, and I won't work with them anymore. But my last one I dealt with was probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and I won't do it anymore.
Yeah, I wrote about one and I called him One Eye because when I let this dog off leash, he jumped into a bush and almost impaled his eyeball. And then other times he would be running so hard playing and he would just stop and roll, but he skinned all his knees. And so skinning his knees would normally be a warning to not stop and roll from a gallop. He continued doing it. So by the time I sent him home, he had one eye and like bare patches on both his front legs. Like, here you go, he had fun. He was just crazy. They have such a different level of intensity the further south they're coming from. So that is, I don't know that I would be placing a dog from Iran in a home. So I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question here. There was kind of a few questions combined into one. Have I?
No, you made a
I think
statement,
you've covered
no
them.
question, but those are pretty profound statements because I agree. And having worked with a lot of them, I cannot, in all good conscience, place one in a home, even when we got them as very young puppies.
And I think this is still going back to, I have to enjoy the dog. So if there's no redeeming qualities in the dog for me, how can I ask someone else to love him? So the Iran dog, I suggested euthanasia. They didn't. And I think this poor guy still has him. The dog was horrid. And even after I had him for a long time and I didn't like him. I never liked him. I always had dread going to work with him. I always knew in some way he was going to hurt me, and not intentionally, just he was so intense that he would do something that would tweak my back or jump up and slam my jaw or something. There was always just some way he was going to do it. He was such a handful. So yeah, they're not all the same. They're certainly not all the same. Even some of the dogs from Taiwan, they are more challenging still. But I've worked with one puppy from there who was, his temperament was awful. And I remember he got handed to me. He must have been about 12 weeks old. And I have him on video. It looks like I'm being handed a tiger and he's just trying to take my face off.
Yeah.
And by the time he went to his people, he actually was one of my favorite dogs that I've ever worked with. I love that little dog. So he was one, but then I worked with another dog from Taiwan who was 6 months old when she came, and I would have euthanized her. And I recommended it to the rescue that they do that, and they didn't. And she's miserable. Like, this dog has no quality of life whatsoever. So she doesn't have any bite in her, so she is safe, but she has zero quality of life and she lives with demons in her head. And I think that's animal abuse.
Yeah, I agree.
Ditto.
All right, so all of that is extremely fascinating. I could listen to the three of you talk for several more hours, but obviously we got to move on. I'm thinking we may need to have a whole episode about dogs from other countries coming over because I have so many questions. But I want to go ahead and move to the portion where we can take questions from attendees. If you have a question, I've got the chat box pulled up. If you want to use that, you can. You just click on the chat box. If you hover over the bottom of your screen and you click on that, it'll come up. You could also just click the raise hand button also along the bottom of your screen. And I think Linda Lundgren is going to make sure that you get unmuted to ask your questions if you want to do it that way. So looks like Helen has a question. Let's see.
Can you hear
There
me?
you go. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, first of all, I have to apologize for coming in late, and I'll definitely listen to the rebroadcast because this is fascinating. And I want to thank the ladies. I could listen for hours more too. But my question, and this is going to sound really, really dumb, but you've got to understand, I started a long time ago. And I don't remember this ever being an issue. I come from the day when the vets told us to get healthy, sound puppies. And, you know, you didn't deliberately go out and get dogs like this. And my question to the ladies is there, I don't want to be general and say, why do you do this? But I'm curious, is there a market for these dogs?
Not
Once
anymore.
you spend hours and
No.
hours and hours of your life and you devoted so much of your talent to these animals, is there a market? I mean, I'm just confused on that. And it's because of my age. I don't remember ever, having to deal with this back in the day. I'm sure it was there, but not for me.
Marina, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll start that one. Helen, you missed the first portion when I defined part of my background as coming from a situation with living in Mexico for 10 years. The situation with pet dog trainers dealing with ferals here in the United States is that, and Linda, I think will support this, is that there's become a cult of how good of a person are you based on how dysfunctional the dog was that you adopted. Like, oh, I get saint points for adopting the worst dog on the planet. And I'm moderating my language because I think of this in New York terms, not polite, politically correct dog trainer terms. But so that's the first problem, is that there's become a cult of let's adopt the worst bloody dog on the planet because that gives us angel points. So that's why we as dog trainers are seeing them. Me, in my personal dogs, as I prefaced the very beginning of this talk, I was in Mexico and the dogs were thrown away on my property. But my Mexican dogs were very, very different. They had some issues, but they were very, very biddable and became the most stable pack I will ever know in my lifetime. When I ended up with 6 of them that came back to the States with me, and I could literally and did go to Europe. My house sitter would come in the morning, open the gate to the dog yard, let them run on the property during the day. They never ever left. They had their patrol routes on the property. The house sitter would come at night, close them into the backyard, and leave the slider to the house open so they could get in and out to the backyard. And I would go to Europe for 2 weeks and never an issue. Most stable pack I ever owned in my life, because not only were they biddable, but they had the exact opposite of what Monique and Linda were dealing with, where they were very high level of self-preservation, not a very low level of self-preservation. So they had an incredibly high level of common sense and an incredibly high level of problem solving, neither of which I absolutely agree with my colleagues. The dogs coming in from distant places don't have. They don't have. But in terms of us as pet dog trainers, it's because it's better now, as Linda said, because the USDA has put a cap on this, we're seeing less and less of it. But there was about a decade when, oh my God, every day the posts on the groups were dealing with some nut job feral from somewhere that someone was trying to convert into a pet dog. And it was insanity. And now, unfortunately, we're seeing this in a lot of crossbred dogs that are not well bred for brains and temperament. So that's where it's coming up in our world for me.
Thank you.
Linda or Monique, did you have a response to Helen's question?
Yeah, dysfunctional owners, as Marina's pointed out, people love their stories. They really, really like, I made the comment earlier about, I have a Podengo or a pot cake from Bali, and he's just a wonderful dog. And here's this quivering looking Basenji Chihuahua mix looking thing hovering from underneath the couch, freaking out because it doesn't know, it's never been given any coping skills. Thank God the USDA banned, there's 123 different countries from importing to the US because of zoonotics and rabies and so on and so forth. And I'll be honest with you, they've already started circumnavigating that because other countries, either to the south or to the north of us, do not have those same things. And hundreds of thousands of dogs are still making it into this country. I don't know what Canada's thing is with importation of dogs, but I know from Mexico, they're coming up in truckloads. How do I know? Because they're making their way through the South all the way up the Eastern Seaboard, of which I think Connecticut is the only state in this country that has banned the importation of dogs that do not have some form of provenance to accompany them. There used to be a problem with them stopping on Route 95 and just saying, hey, come get your free doggy, right? You know, or whatever. And a couple of veterinarians got together and stopped that practice. So now they kind of circumnavigate around parts of New England in order to get to Massachusetts and Maine, where they'll still take these dogs. Because why? There's no dogs in the shelters up there, right? There's reasons for that. Turkey is one of the biggest importers or exporters of dogs into this country, or had been, because of the quote unquote meat trade. But I don't know, I defy any one of you to tell me how many purebred Goldens you see that weigh 80, 90 pounds that are part of the meat trade, right? But they come over here and there's a huge market, because once these dogs hit our shores and once these people adopt these dogs, all of a sudden they're saddled with these huge burdens. These dogs don't know how to act. These people don't know how to deal with them. And of all the trainers that are here among us, I guarantee that a larger percentage of the people that you're dealing with, as far as clients go at this point, are first-time pet owners, have never owned a dog before, and their first default choice is a rescue. And the vast majority of rescues that we're starting to see in the mid-Atlantic and along the Eastern Seaboard are all dogs from out of the area. So we still see them. We still see a high number of feral dogs, not just badly bred, mixed bred, but a high number of feral dogs.
Monique, do you have anything to add as far as, you know, the quote unquote market surrounding this, or the reason we're seeing these dogs?
I do. Up here where I am, it was huge money. Like, they're bringing in truckloads of dogs, like 60 dogs, and they're selling them for $1,000 a pop. So that's huge money. So that's how all of these dogs started to end up here. And the sadder the story, the more you can get for them. Like, I always joked, if I took a leg off Leppy, I could have had 20 homes to choose from for that poor dog. So everyone wants that sad story. And for the people that were doing it, it was massive profit. It has slowed down a little bit now, because we're still able to bring them in from Mexico by the truckload, but a lot of the other countries got shut down. So of those Mexican dogs, Leppy was one that came up on a truck. He wasn't yet ready to come. The rescue had said he wasn't ready, but the people that were importing him, he was so cute, they knew they could sell him. And he was sold within, I think, a day of arriving in Canada. And then he ran away from his first home. So then he ended up with a trainer. He ran away from her. He ended up in the pound. Then he ended up with another trainer that he lived with for a year. And then he was with another trainer for like 6 months. And then she told me about it one evening after class, and I ripped her head off. And then I felt so guilty that I agreed to meet him the next day. Then upon seeing him, he was such a mess. It was just awful. He was tied into the seatbelt of the front of her car. She opened up the door. He dove out, smashed his chin on the ground, dove back in, dove out, smashed his chin on the ground, dove back in, and then smashed his chin a third time. And she just stood there watching him. And I couldn't take him from her quick enough and just put him in my car. Like, this poor dog was just tortured mentally. It was absolutely awful. So I haven't gotten into training these dogs because there's a market. No, it's because I'm a sucker and I can't stand watching dogs suffer like some of the really bad ones are. Fox was catatonic. He wouldn't even do anything. He just looked so angry and shut down. It was just absolutely heartbreaking looking at him. So that's how I end up with these dogs. And then I'm stuck with them forever because there is no market for dogs like that. So
You're not wrong.
I feel that, especially the sucker part.
Yep.
So any more questions from anyone? Remember, you can type it in the chat box if you use the chat button at the bottom of the screen, or you can use the raise hand button on the bottom of the screen if you have a question you'd like to ask. We'll give a few more minutes just in case somebody has one, or any thoughts anyone wants to share.
Well, I'm really curious what people's feedback is and what they're seeing in their areas.
Yeah. I'd love to hear from other people. I am in Kentucky, and we already have our own overpopulation problem with us being closer to the south. So we are the ones who send our dogs up north. Just ours,
Thank you, stop.
not other countries. So the ferals that I see are more the think Amish puppy mill style. It's been in a cage and been used to breed and never taken out, and so all it knows is life in a box. At least that's my assumption. I don't know the true backstory on any of them, but just based on what usually happens around here and what I see, that's the kind of, and usually it's not feral, thank God, but that's where the ferals I have met seem to have come from.
There's a
Never
difference between
touched.
feral and ignored.
Yeah.
We're less than
Well,
100 miles from Lancaster, so we see a lot of those. But Pennsylvania has enacted some fairly stringent laws because of the Amish, and they're producing dogs like, vegetables. But now the big thing is the nice farm, right? Actually is a storefront. It's a nice farm. Young Amish couple, one clean litter of puppies that are frolicking happily in a hay, in a nice, beautiful, clean stall in the barn. Of course, there's no dam, there's no sire, and these puppies are just kind of milling around going, hey, look at how much freedom we have. Yay. It's bad.
Yeah, and that's a good point, the difference between feral and ignored. And I will say the one thing that I've seen consistently the same with the ones I've seen that come from that sort of thing is the first place they end up is lost, roaming. So they have a long period of time of roaming before I ever see them. And I think that's where they end up crossing that line from being more ignored and unsocialized to going into that wild state or wild mentality.
I don't think it takes much, to be honest with you. It's kind of the same thing that happens when you take a dog who's been a house pet all its life and it escapes because of a thunderstorm or whatever, and it's on the run for like 24 hours, and animal control picks it up and flukes it into some shelter someplace. They come out traumatized. They come out changed, and it takes them a long time to recover from that. So
Yeah.
I'm thinking that the same thing, especially young adult dogs that get they get turned out into the wilderness to fend for themselves. And right down the road from us right now, it's actually horses. People can't afford their horses, and they're turning horses out loose to live in the mountains, right? West Virginia, Virginia, so on and so forth. And it's the same with the dogs. And when you can catch them, they're like, I want to come near you, but I'm afraid, but I want to come near you, but I'm afraid. But they're different. They are very different.
Yeah. It's funny, like I mentioned earlier, where I've seen kind of after a little bit of progress, and I don't think you were here for this part, Monique, but I was talking about with some of the dogs I've worked with, I've seen after a little progress and they start to actually trust me, which for me, it takes quite some time. I start to see mannerisms and gesture behaviors from them that you would normally see in a dog that is soliciting attention and wants to be touched and wants to be held. And then they have this mental block where they can't, at least at first, follow through. And so it's almost like they have the genetic components there telling them what they're supposed to be doing. But in this case, they haven't actually had the experiences to know how to follow through on it. And that's the best way I can explain it is you see all the excitement, all the happiness, and all the things you see, and the dog's happy to see you, and you reach down and they go, oh, no, we can't do that. Like, that's not what we do. I just get excited to see you. It's fascinating to me. I think for me, like I said, my experience has been limited, so a lot of it is just learning and learning all about working or using what I've learned about pressure to navigate through one versus the next, because it's never the same.
I had a moment with Leppy. He would come up and let me touch him quite fast, but it was limited touch and he'd just meander off again. But I can't remember how long I'd had him. I'm going to say it was probably about 10 days. He jumped up on the bed and cuddled in with me, and then started like rolling on me and rubbing his neck on my arm. And I've never seen a dog do this before. I've never seen it happen again. And the whole encounter made the hair on the back of my neck go up. So he was being affectionate with me, but he was very uncertain in how he was doing it. So he kind of jump on the bed, rub his head on my arm, kiss me, jump off, come back, do it again. But there was something about it, and I don't know how to define what it was, but it was the most uncomfortable, or one of the more uncomfortable experiences I've had with a dog. And I've thought about this for years, about why. And I think now that I think part of him he was unsure about doing it, but I think there was a little bit of aggression there towards me in it. Now, looking back, honestly, it was just the weirdest experience. I've never had it again. And he did do it with one of my employees at one point in time as well. And she said the same, like the hair on the back of her neck went up when he was doing it. It was the weirdest thing ever. And I think now, like looking back, if he had have been my dog, and he wasn't, he belonged to the rescue. But if he had have been my dog, I think after that, I might euthanize him now if I saw that again, another dog. Even though he was being friendly, there was just something about it that was really weird.
Do you think it was the tension? And, I know when we're talking about fearful dogs, they tend to put themselves in a position that they can't handle, and then boom, you have a snap, especially if they're in a moment of exhilaration and they just kind of act on it. Did it feel kind of like that?
Could he have been scent marking, or just that, post-adolescent, because he had no real examples on how to behave, that he basically was just offering a whole bunch of different, instinctual signals, but he couldn't quite land on one?
I'm not entirely sure what it was. I really don't know. I think the rubbing his head on me was a little bit of that, like a little bit of a push. But honestly, I've never seen it before again, so I don't know what to say about it.
Interesting.
It was the weirdest thing ever.
My friend Julie is saying that she thinks the dog was baiting you, Monique.
She will be.
It's possible.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Sorry,
I said that.
I missed that.
Friend Jewel commented that she said, "I think this dog was baiting Monique."
I think I agree with her. Now, he ended up getting more affection after that. So it was only the first time that he did that. After that, he got more friendly and normal and would cuddle with me in bed. And bedtime became his favorite time of day, even in his next home. So it was only that first time or two that he did it. But I agree with her. I think he was baiting me. I think there was a little bit of uncertainty there. So as he went forward, I think he was also ready to switch his opinions fast if needed. And I think that's what I was picking up on. But he only did it with one other person. And after that, he cuddled nicely in his next home. So it went away. But honestly, it was one of the weirdest experiences I have ever had with a dog.
And Marina?
One of the big differences that I see between dogs from 40 years ago and now is that I actually see a lot of that kind, maybe not exactly like that, but definitely what Linda was saying, that because dogs are raised in so much more isolation than they used to be, that I see a lot of confused experimenting with social language. And because I have stable adult dogs here, when they come in, I see them, and hopefully, at least at times, I'm reasonably stable. I see a lot of that. I see a lot of what Linda was describing as experimentation. I've had a lot of dogs do a sideways head rub on arms or legs, scent marking kind of behavior. And exactly what Linda is describing, I see just a vast amount of chaos and language confusion that we didn't used to see. That they're like trying on pieces of language to see, not even intentionally, it's just like, instead of being able to access normal dog alphabet. As they try and access something, pieces, fragments and pieces come out. And I would say from 40 years ago to now, I see a steady increase in that level of chaos of social language, so that now I pretty much expect it with any of the dogs I've seen in the last 3 years, especially. I see, and especially to your point, Terry, of the post-COVID dogs that are coming in total social isolation from, even puppies raised with their dam and their siblings. Still very few, unless it's a top level breeder, are introducing stress or resilience games to the pups in their infancy. And they're coming in with such aberrant collections of social language like I've never seen before. And
I agree.
yeah, just an inability to access, and so they do what Linda was describing. They'll throw out pieces. So I haven't seen, I understand exactly what you're seeing when like they throw out a piece and then there's kind of like that hairs on the back of your neck feeling where they're throwing out kind of an opposite piece, but they're not really intentionally doing any of that. It's just chaos. It's just internal social language chaos. So I think that part of this discussion is really fruitful in terms of not just ferals, but this whole new world of what we're seeing as pet dog trainers, because I think language confusion and lack of concrete social language is a huge issue. It's one of the pieces that we teach in clinics, is how to channel that and develop that and get that cleaner. Curious what Linda has seen, because I'm seeing it all the time.
I see it every day. I mean, and the thing is it's not something you can teach. It's not something you can teach humans. I mean, dogs are easy. We do dog modeling. As a matter of fact, I'm looking for my replacement to my dog Pearl, because she's now 10 and I need to start curating that before she's too old to do anything. I have a house full of intact male dogs because I'm an idiot. And my one spayed female, and she basically is our chief puppy wrangler and yard boss, and that's her job, is to help teach dogs appropriate social signals. And I mean, she's more heavily employed than I am right now. I mean, this dog, she works because the only way that people are able to sit there and look and understand what it is their dog is saying is they have to take the time to watch them. And they don't. They automatically assume that the dog is somehow defective because it acts a certain way. And of course, I've had dogs all my life, and my last dog, just like this breed, didn't act that way, and so on and so forth. And we've all heard it ad nauseum. But the thing is, though, is if they listen carefully enough, the dog's going to tell them exactly what they need. And my default behavior to teach most people is to just simply stop moving and let the dog make the determining factor, because the vast majority of dogs, even if they, and aggression is a symptom, it's not a disease. And the vast majority of dogs who decide that all of a sudden they want to test the water and see if they can push you around by showing teeth or growling or whatever, if you don't respond to that, they got nothing. They're like, well, shit, what do I do now? Right? And they just kind of stop. And people are just, people become hysterics. So then when that happens, then the dog's like, oh my God, the dog freaks out. Then the person freaks out. Then the dog freaks out. So the dog learns to start patterning all these different signals, because that's the only thing that's enabled them to survive. Right. And I think a lot of that, because the topic is feral dogs, I think a lot of that, these dogs have to learn how to adapt on the fly. A bunch of kids are running them down, throwing bottles at them and rocks and what have you, and shaking sticks and scaring them. So they basically learn that sudden movements mean, bad things are going to happen. So I need to be defensive. And I think that they start, what's the word you use, Marina? They start experimenting. They start experimenting with using whatever behavior is available in their little repertoire of behaviors to find out exactly what kind of feedback they can extract. And I think it's healthy for a dog to do that, but I think it's really important that the people they do it with know what they're saying when they do it.
Right.
So, and it's like I have a tendency, I make this joke all the time. I'm old and I'm slow and I'm fat and I can't move out of my own way, but it's a good thing because the vast majority of the time I'm going to be the turtle and not the hare. And the vast majority of dogs are going to kind of sit there and look at me like, well, that didn't work. What do I do now? The same nothing you were doing 2 seconds ago is fine with me, pal. Right? But people don't want to do that. They want to respond. And new trainers, and I'm not saying young trainers because most trainers entering the business are considerably older. They don't understand that. They want to just go and make things happen. And that is detrimental to dogs, period. Feral dogs, absolutely. They can't move that fast. They can't process information that fast.
So then we have a couple comments. I'm going to paraphrase those, and then I have a question of my own that relates to these comments. So Frangel she just commented that she thinks the problem's deeper than just ferals. It's general public treating dogs like humans with no leadership, which I don't think any of us are going to disagree with that at all. I very much agree. And then Jana Sturth said that she wishes some of our younger members were here because they're the generation having to know more about these current trends. And I agree with that as well. So I will say one thing that I have seen, and I've remarked on it a few times recently, and this is just over the past 12, 13 years, I used to be able to do a group class, and it was very, very rare that I couldn't walk up to somebody's dog and use it to demonstrate something. I just take the dog away, the dog will work with me, everybody's happy. It is getting harder and harder, especially in the first week or two of my classes, for me to just grab a random dog and demonstrate. In fact, I'd say about 60% of the time, it's not going to work. And that floors me. Like, it's a testament to where we're at with the genetics that we have available and obviously the way that people treat dogs. So my question is, and I know it's not an easy one to answer, we don't know for sure, but do you feel like it is at the end of the day a problem of people just don't understand what is a dog and how to communicate? They're having to throw out these signs like Marina was saying, experimenting, trying to figure this out. Is most of that because we don't know what we're seeing, we don't know how to respond, we don't make any sense?
Marina.
Sure, I'll give it a quick one, and then I just need to say I'm going to have to leave pretty quick here, old lady time here. But and I'm really curious to hear what my colleagues have to say about this. But rephrase it short again, just so I focus my.
But yeah, do you feel like the main problem with the dogs that we're seeing today in insecurity is more about the fact that we don't make sense to them because we can't read them anymore?
Yes, no, maybe. I just wrote a whole article that I thought I sent to NADOI, but maybe not. That's called "Is Dog Still Dog as We Knew Him?" And I think that it's a complex piece of about 10 factors, which I go into. I didn't think to review that, to have that off the top of my head, but it's a very, very critical piece that it has to do with lack of proprioception, lack of development, lack of structure, lack of genetics. It's a complex blend of a variety of things. Celebration of dysfunctionality. There are a number of factors that are acting, and I think that it's really critical that we start to understand that, exactly as you said, I can no longer walk into a clinic that I'm teaching in which the prerequisite for attending is that the dog has to be handleable and have even the majority, over 50% of the dogs, truly handleable. Because what's normal to Monique and Linda and myself, what we just take as a clear expectation is not normal to our younger colleagues, younger in terms of being in the industry. What we consider to be a normal dog is a unicorn anymore. And I think it's a huge issue for us. And I think that for organizations like NADOI, it's critical for us to address it, because how we approach the whole dog training equation, but the but the training of the partnership of the dog and the human, we got to change. It's not the same. It's not the same as it was.
I agree 100%. And we do have to wrap up pretty quickly because we've already gone over, but I just want to give Linda and Monique a chance if you have comments on that topic.
It's like Marina said, there's so many facets. There's, we no longer, having dysfunctional dogs is basically the new social currency, and mixed bred dogs, random bred dogs, all these things are basically how people are starting to identify the fact that we celebrate our own dysfunction, and that we're celebrating our dog's dysfunction as part of that. But primarily, I'll be honest with you, I'm a geezer myself. The vast majority of problems that I see with people today is just a lack of experience. I was raised in an agricultural community. The further away from agriculture we have become, the further away from nature we have become, the more of a problem it is. People don't look at dogs anymore and think companion, they think ornament, they think accoutrement, they think that this is something that enhances me. It's not something that I have to address because of its own individuality. And that's a huge problem for me. Huge.
I agree. Monique, do you have any comments to share?
I agree with everything that has been said by the two ladies. Like, it's bang on. And I have so many things going through my head for this question now. But as a society now, it's cool to have a reactive dog. And no one says that you need to change your reactive dog. You just have to accept it. And then everyone around you now must modify their behavior to accommodate your reactive dog. So it's not only accepted, it's kind of just the norm now. Like, that's just the way it is. I don't think people have even realized you can actually change it now. Like, it kind of boggles my mind. And I think politics reflect that. Like, everything is so interconnected here. And I totally agree with the point. We're so away from wildlife and farm animals. Like, people have no idea about being outdoors anymore. And the way they connect to all animals, it shows. Like stopping to take photos of a bear. Like, really, people?
The bison in Yellowstone.
Yeah. And training is failing so badly. Like, it's become so complicated. When I'm reading some of the articles out there, it's so difficult. Like, no wonder people can't do it. And it really isn't that hard. Like, it needs to be made simple again. But people are being told if you put a simple correction on a dog, that dog will hate you forevermore. And my clients struggle with it so much. Like, this one darling couple, their dog bit her quite badly. And we were at the point now of grooming her dog. Dog was fine with me. I'm showing her how she does it. Dog swings its head around and goes for her wrist. And before dog could even connect, it got bopped on the nose with the comb. And dog just kind of laid back down for another half hour and continued getting brushed. She could not believe that I did that and that her dog didn't hate her. And 3 weeks later, she was still talking about the fact that her dog didn't hate her after being corrected, and her dog loved her more and was sweeter. So it's been so ingrained into people now that corrections are evil and will ruin your relationship with your dog. It's just everything. There's so much. So,
well, there's no discipline in human children. Why would there be discipline in their dogs?
Exactly.
So.
Exactly. And even if you're looking at the different generations of people, like, the younger generation can't take that feedback either. So of course they can't deliver it to their dogs. So just everything in our world has kind of changed in the last 3 years, right down to like the last 5 board and trains I've had. One was the most dangerous dog I have ever worked with, like, unbelievable. And not a single, like, I have it on video, his warning. And I bet you if I was to show that to dog trainers, there's probably only 1% that would be able to see his warning, because he just kind of stopped and did nothing. But I knew, like, the hair on the back of my neck said, don't do anything. And I had to stay there for 45 minutes until a good Samaritan rescued me, because he would not walk. Well, he would, but he was going to eat me in the process. He was so scary. And then the other last 2 board and trains I had, was so problematic, but compared to him, were like delightful. And that's what I'm seeing now in my board and trains, is the level of dog I'm getting is so much worse than what it ever has been before.
Yeah, behaviors.
And then and more dangerous, less signals, less warning, more dangerous, more extreme. And I would say right down to pet class, I agree. I've always taken dogs and done demos. And dogs are just getting so much more dangerous, willing to use their teeth, but willing to follow it through as well, not just a sample, don't do that. So everything's just changed so much. It's kind of scary thinking about where it's going to go, because the laws are going to have to follow where dogs are now, which means we're all going to end up not being allowed to have them shortly if this continues, from what I'm seeing. And it sounds like you ladies are all seeing the same. So
it's happening here already. I mean, the legislation that it's just ungodly. I mean, a lot of it doesn't affect trainers directly, but a lot of it, you know, like homeowners associations, there's not any place you can go in most of metropolitan United States that doesn't have a homeowners association. And they have these codes that you can't have dogs of certain breeds, you can't have dogs of certain sizes. And people are actively choosing to live that way because they don't want to live with dogs of certain breeds. They don't want to live with dogs over certain size. And there's whole communities. I mean, we're talking 20, 30,000 people in a community that are like, yeah, no to dogs. No dogs in public spaces, no dogs in our public greens, no dogs anywhere except in your home and in your car. That's it. And
wow,
I find that fairly unfortunate. I mean, I've been in the Mid-Atlantic now for 35 years this year. And every place I've gone, every place I've left, let's put it that way, has been polluted by people who have a tendency to think, well, if she can do it, I can do it. And they're basically poisoning all of these resources that I spent 35 years developing. There's places I can't go now with my well-trained, well-mannered dogs because of what other people have done. It's spreading. You know, anything that happens on the extreme West Coast and anything that happens on an extreme East Coast has a tendency to meet in the middle, and it's coming. It's coming.
100%. We've had a couple of comments. I'm just going to sum them up. Anita was talking about the mentality around animal rights groups, and Janice also mentioned people adopting these dogs and wanting to brag about these rescue dogs, and then, you know, not being willing to basically say no. You know, that word has just kind of fallen off the face of the earth with our vocabulary. So that's something that I think could make a really interesting topic in the future. You know, rescue shelters are shooting themselves in the foot, and kind of like the dog training industry, we're kind of ruining dogs from the inside out. So I will make a note. Those will be very interesting things for us to talk about. But of course, we've got to wrap this up because we've gone over. I want to thank everybody who was able to attend and weigh in the comments. Marina.
Just one quick thing in closing. I think that one of the roles that NADOI can play, because I always like to think, okay, we have issues, but what can we do to solve this? Is it's really, really critical for young trainers to start to learn what normal is. And one of the ways in which they can learn what normal is to get their butts out and into the competition ring. Because when I teach, 85 to 90% of young trainers do no competition, zero, none. They have never seen, they've never raised a puppy. They've never raised a puppy. They don't know what a normal puppy is. They don't know what a normal breed dog is. They don't know what the breeds are or what they're supposed to be like or what they're supposed to act like. All they know is dysfunctionality. If all you know is dysfunctionality, that's going to be your worldview. And I think that as an organization, we can really push back, you know, becoming aware. At all my clinics, I push hard for my people to get out there and see what normal is. You can't know what you're doing if you don't have a realistic assessment of what normal is. Monique can push these dogs and do what she does because she knows where she's going. Linda can push these dogs because she knows where she's going. She knows what her end destination is. They know what their end destination is. They know what normal looks like. But our younger colleagues, They have no idea what normal looks like. No idea. 85% of my colleagues in any given clinic or conference that I go to have been training for 10 years or less. That means they've never known a world without crossbreds. They have no idea.
Or
So,
the adopt, don't shop mentality.
right. And so
Yep.
one of the things I think we can do as an organization, and I will shut up because we all got to go leave the call, is really, we have the depth of knowledge within NADOI to really help people understand what normal is. My sister and I have a phrase from the old TV commercial. This isn't how it's supposed to work. This isn't how any of this is supposed to work. And we need to be really sounding that bell, because that's what's happening in the dog world. As Monique said, the celebration of, oh, I have a reactive dog. You got to be frigging kidding me. Like, what is wrong with you? Like,
They have to want that though, Marina, and most of them don't. They want a fast paycheck. That's all they want.
well, yes and no. I'm finding that they do. They've never been exposed to the dialogue. And so it's up to us to initiate the dialogue.
Well, I've been doing that for a fairly long time, and the vast
I-
majority of people have been like, I don't want to compete with my dog. I don't need to do that. My pet owners don't need that. Yeah, they do. The obedience in the ring is the same obedience you use outside the ring, but they don't want to hear that.
I think a lot of it is the kind of the same problem all around. Like those that have the passion to be in this industry don't always have the mentor to help them with that competition side. That was the case for me. Like they don't know that world. So I'm 41 years old, just jumping into it myself, but not for lack of wanting to. So that's something that NADOI can also help with, even from a distance, is being that example of, hey, this is a great way to really show your stuff and see what you can do and gain experience. But yes, we do need to go ahead and wrap up. I am ever so grateful to you, Marina, Linda, Monique, for all of you taking time out of your day and putting up with me and my confusing emails to be part of this. I'm hoping this is just the first of many more to come. So to our attendees, thank you as well. And if you have any ideas for topics that we could cover or members that we could bring in, or you want to be on the panel yourself or something, then feel free to reach out to me, Terry Spencer. You can message me. And you could also send me an email, terry@taketheleash.com is the best one to use. But again, thank you guys so much, and we'll go ahead and close now. And we appreciate you.
Thank you for having us. I'm more than happy to be here.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys.